So today I'm going to be taking a look at the Baltany 1921 from AliExpress, clearly inspired by the Vacheron of the same name. I think this is a pretty cool watch, probably one of the better values that exists on AliExpress, and yeah, let's take a closer look. As a side note, if you want to join the Discord group for the channel, I will have a link down below to the Patreon. Basically, all funds from that will be going to a giveaway pool where all funds are going towards giveaways throughout the years for either watches, straps, other things, so hope to see you there. So we have a diameter of 38 millimeters, lugs a lug of 43.9, height of 10.5, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch: we're going to have the Seagull ST 1901 movement beating away in here. This is an automatic movement, but we of course have a closed case back. The movement does not have hacking, so of course if you pull out the crown, it doesn't stop the movement, so keep that in mind. It does have hand winding though. We do have a sapphire crystal on front, which is pretty nice because it's not only a little bit raised, but it's also domed pretty well and I think looks pretty premium. It also states that it has an AR coating, but it doesn't state whether it's on the outside or the inside. The watch comes with 50 meters of stated water resistance with just a push-pull crown and retails directly from AliExpress for about $170. So starting off with the dial here, and I do think this is probably one of the best parts about this watch and is really very high quality. You can see we have applied metallic numerals everywhere except the 3 o'clock where we have the sub-seconds taking over. I think it looks pretty premium. None of the numerals are cut off in any way too, which is a nice touch. The numerals are polished extremely well, so any tiny movement really catches the light. It glints very evenly, very cleanly, and they are just really nicely done. The handset too has this beautiful spade shape to it, but it has a roundedness to both the hour hand and the minutes hand, so kind of, even if the numerals aren't lining up, you do get some play in the hands, which is nice to see it. It just gives a lot more life to the watch than you would expect. Usually hands are pretty flat, pretty one-dimensional at this price point. So to see a curved handset with this much detail that you'll definitely see when we get a little closer is awesome. In the sub-seconds track, we have supposedly a heat blued hand there. It has a little bit of an odd tone and not really that similar to heat bluing that I've seen before, but that's what they stated it is, so I'll go along with that. It could be possibly painted, but it's not too cheap looking, so I'll give it a pass. The text is kept very minimal. All we have is Baltany here at the very top 12 o'clock and no other text on the face of the watch. We of course have the Railroad's outer track, which is nice. It's done in black, which matches the sub-seconds track here, and that's pretty much it. The main focus of this dial as well, I think, is this kind of subtle texture that we have to it. This is based off the Vacheron 1921, I believe they call it the Platine or something very close to that, which was a limited edition of 100 pieces done in platinum with a platinum dial. This dial tries to replicate that effect and giving it a little bit of a sandblasted metallic sheen look and finish, and I think it does look really premium. It works perfectly with all the tones on the watch, with that gray monotone overall theme, and even up close I think it is really good looking. So let's take a closer look. So zooming in here on the dial, we see there is a lot of detail to just enjoy. Again, that kind of metallic sheen to the dial goes a little bit darker at some angles, a lot brighter at others, so it has this almost subtle sparkly effect, and it does capture multiple tones of gray and silver within the dial. So it's a very dynamic dial for being what on the surface looks pretty simple. You can see the text is done fairly well. It's not overly thick. It could be printed over a couple more layers, I think. But as it's done here, I think it's fine. It's very legible. There isn't any misprinting, and the same goes for the Railroad's track and the sub-seconds track as well, all done in a very similar print to the text logo. Focusing for a second on this handset, which I think is probably one of the best parts about this watch, and this is something that does go a little bit away from the original Vacheron and uses a different handset, where I believe that one uses Brigade, this one uses Spade. And I think it complements it really well and looks very interesting. You can see the point of that Spade hand is very long, it's very defined. There isn't any kind of roughness around the edges of the metal, which you typically see at watches of this price point, if not higher. So it's very nice to see how well done the handset is. As you can see, as I move the watch around, it catches every tiny little bit of light, every tiny little surface reflects beautifully because you have that gentle curvature to the handset. So it is just a beautifully done, really well executed handset that, again, I don't expect to see at this price point. It does pretty much blow my mind because even looking at the minutes hand, you see it has this beautiful hourglass shape. It gets very thin here towards the middle and then thickens again towards the end, and then still comes into this very fine point. Again, no sharpness to the metal, no really imperfections in the finishing or the polishing. It does all look pretty premium and way better done than some watches I've seen for much more money. You can see looking at the numerals, they have a similar beauty about them. They aren't too tall off the dial, they aren't too thin either. They have a beautiful polishing to them that's very even, very consistent. There isn't really any blemishing to most of the markers. There's tiny little specks here and there, but overall, really well done, catches the light beautifully. And again, going around, I mean, I've looked at, let's say, for example, Fears, which is at about $4,000, I believe, maybe $3,500. And it was finished to a much lower standard than this. So this coming in at just under $200 is fantastic. You can see there with the 7, there is a little bit of like a pitting or a little bit of a bite mark out of the metal. But even then, it's such a small, tiny little thing that with the rest of the finishing, it is, I think, forgiven. And taking a second to look at that quote-unquote blued hand, again, not a blue tone I'm kind of used to seeing, or maybe it's just how small the hand is, or maybe the heat bluing that they did to it. I don't quite know. It looks slightly off to me, but again, it's not a cheap looking blue, so I'll take it. Overall, fantastic dial, amazing for the price point, and I really don't think there's anything wrong with it. So taking a look at the watch in natural light, we can see that the dial with the sun-blasted effect has this kind of shimmery quality to it. At extreme angles, you do get a more pure white tone. At more softer angles and kind of more shaded light, you end up getting this more dark gray silver tone. Overall, it looks great in direct sunlight. The numerals don't really pop as much as they do in the shade, but there is a lot of depth to the dial. Whereas in shade, the numerals and the case are kind of what are popping the most. The dial tends to lean more purish whitish silver and not as dark gray as it does in direct sunlight. Undoubtedly, the way the markers pop, the hands pop, the way the case shines and just looks great at every angle, it is a very good looking case in pretty much any lighting situation. So moving on to the case of this watch, and we do have the classic cushion style. You have very rounded edges. The actual top side of the case is actually very rounded as well. We have all high polish everywhere, so there isn't any surprises in finishing, but the polishing is done well. It's applied evenly. There isn't any cheapness about the finishing, in my opinion, and it looks just as good as the dial. Of course, you have the crown here at the 12 o'clock, or what would more traditionally be about the 2 o'clock, and it is a little bit hard to access, a little bit hard to wind. You can get in there, you can get used to it, so it's not terrible, but it's not the most functional. When you actually pull the crown out though, it's a little bit easier because the crown is further from the case, so that's not as big of an issue. The winding itself, it's pretty rough. It's not a good sound to it. Again, this is where the watch shows its price point. I do think if they put a better movement into it, a lot of people would be willing to pay that difference in price. You can see the case shape is very evenly built. You have a beautiful rounded top of the case there. The bottom of the case kind of mirrors that. And it just does come together very nicely on wrist. It's not the traditional kind of concave curve you would see with most watches. It's more of a convex shape, but it's no less comfortable on the wrist. Of course, partially because maybe it's a little bit shorter in length and it just sits well, but really no harsh edges or anything like that, so it is just a joy to wear. And then moving on to the case back, just simple high polish, a little bit of information on the bottom there. Beautiful amount of kind of screws in the back that kind of gives you an idea of it being very sturdily fastened, pretty nicely done. So can't complain really. And before I move on, again, I just do really love the shape of this watch. They didn't cheap out and make a very flat, kind of one-dimensional topped square. They really gave this beautiful curves, a beautiful subtle curve as well, that just is very pleasing, really draws the eye in, kind of makes the case feel thinner than it actually is because the topmost part is kind of the least amount of metal. It curves away and goes down. So it's a very interesting visual effect. It's a very interesting case shape we don't see a lot in watchmaking, especially in the lower price points. So it's nice of Baltany to kind of democratize that. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this very cool quartz watch from Castle and Gazelle. And just for reference, I believe this is a 39mm watch. So here we have the watch on my 6.5 inch wrist. I think you can tell it wears pretty perfectly. Again, this is almost like a lugless watch in a sense because the lugs are so short. It is almost like a two-piece case where the main case body has the lugs that are then bolted on because the lugs don't feel integrated into the watch. And I think that helps the wearing experience and you really just feel and see the head of the watch the most. Of course, because it is this squarish type shape, it does take up a lot of surface area on the wrist. It is a bigger wearing watch at 38 than another 38 circular watch would be, but it doesn't wear badly at all. I think it definitely is doable on my wrist. If I move it up, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist there, and it still fits pretty nicely. And you can definitely go up to a larger wrist size just because, well, it has that presence to it. You can see kind of a down the barrel shot. The watch wears pretty close to the wrist, which I really like. Again, it's very comfortable. What's really nice too is the crown ends up not digging into your wrist. So it's a kind of hidden benefit of this driver style. You can see the watch sits pretty much flush into the wrist. It fits very comfortably. It doesn't feel any taller than it is. It doesn't feel any bulkier than you would expect it to be. And it feels really honestly like a very svelte kind of dressy type watch. If this had a manual wind movement or a thinner automatic or a micro rotor in it, it would feel awesome on the wrist and just that much more premium. Just as a note, this is not the original strap. I have honestly no idea where I put the original strap, but it is nothing to write home about. I think it is serviceable maybe until you find a new one, but I would definitely put this on a more expensive strap or a more quality strap just because this watch definitely deserves it in my opinion. This one is from Has No Bounds, and I think this gray tone matches perfectly with the tones of the watch. I think this watch does dress and casual very well, and this monotone color tone only helps that. You can see though it's a little hard to catch on camera, but again, even though this is a fairly thin-ended strap, it'll start to divot along the middle there just because it has to be so close to that case. So if you have a favorite strap that happens to fit on this watch, maybe think twice about it or order another one because that divot may stay if you put it on something else. Next, we have this very cool cork strap from Jean Rousseau in collaboration with Theo and Harris. This is a very thin-ended strap, so it works well on this watch. There's no issue. It doesn't even overly rub and meet the very end of the case, so this is kind of the perfect type of strap for this watch. And to me, it actually looks pretty good. Adds a little bit more color to the watch, adds a little bit of that kind of textural feel from the cork. Overall, I like it, and you can definitely put a lot of different colors on this strap because the dial of the face is so monotone. Next, to almost dress it up or just make it kind of cooler and more interesting, we have this more textured fabric strap from Strap Bandits. This I think looks pretty cool, obviously plays off the blue tones of the little seconds hand there, and I think just works with that cooler tone of the gray. A little bit of that texture from the houndstooth, just enough of a pattern without being too blatant or in your face, and looks good on the watch in my opinion. And lastly, to add a little bit of color to the watch, we have this pink silicone strap off of Amazon. I honestly don't even know where my white Archer is, so this is a cool stand-in. I think it looks pretty cool on the watch, adds a lot more fun to it, it makes it a little less serious, and is comfortable. Looks great. I think a little bit of pop of color to the watch because again, it's so monotone, any color can take to it, but I think these fun, vibrant colors do great. Super comfortable from the silicone and gives it a little bit more of a sporty feel than you would expect. So pros and cons of this Baltany. And for me, one of the biggest pros, of course, is gonna be the size of it. It's nice to see that they went with a sub 40mm case. Squares tend to wear larger than you would expect them to. They have a lot more surface area. So these cushion type cases really work well with smaller sizes, even if you have a larger wrist. It's also very interesting they went with 38mm here because it's between the two sizes that the Vacheron that it's inspired by comes in. We either have a 36 or a 40mm for the Vacheron, and here we have the 38. So it's nice to kind of cut the difference, and I think it's a good in-between for people who like smaller watches but don't want something too small. I think it's a very nice happy medium. And following on from the case itself, I think it's actually very well constructed. It doesn't have any harsh edges, it's machined very well, it's smooth, it's comfortable. There's a lot of rounded surfaces on the watch, which I would say you don't typically see with cheaper cushion style cases. They tend to go for more harsh angles and more jagged edges in a sense. So this one's actually machined very well, and the case is done pretty nicely. And lastly, I think they did a fantastic job with the dial. This dial is undoubtedly much more impressive and much more put together than you would expect for this price point. We're talking under $200, but we get beautiful indices that are fully high polished. We get a dial that has this subtle glimmer kind of blasted effect to it. The watch even has a gorgeous curved handset, which you don't even see in watches way more expensive than this, 5-10 times the price even. It's rare to see handsets with a lot of dimensionality to them. You usually get one dimension, or if you're really lucky, it's bifaceted. But here we actually have a parabolic, almost U-type shape to the handset. There's a beautiful, gentle curve, and that really plays with the light in an interesting way. You don't get from one, anything I've seen on AliExpress, but two, really anything I've usually seen under $1,000. So moving on to cons, and while I don't have many with this watch, there are a couple. I think one of the biggest ones will be that the crown is very hard to wind. I've never personally had hands-on with the Vacheron this model is based off of, but it looks constructed pretty similarly, so I don't know if that also has an issue with the crown winding, but this one definitely does. Sometimes when you get it at the right angle, it can be okay, but it's not nearly as comfortable as something that's at the 3 o'clock or really anywhere else, because you're getting a little bit of just obstruction from that lug being there. With that being said, the watch is automatic, so you can just kind of shake it around to get it started, and realistically, you should be okay that way if you never want to wind it, you know, just because you don't want to deal with that weird crown action. Another con I have for sure is the fact that the lug holes are just very close to the case. It's one of those things where if you have a strap that's a little thicker on the edges, like where that bar meets the case, or where the bar really meets the leather, it won't fit into this case here. There are some straps you have to have that are pretty thin. I even have some thin straps that really won't even fit on this case. It's kind of hit or miss. So not all your regular straps will fit. And then if you use a curved strap, you'll have a tiny bit of a gap there. So it's not really a win-win situation. You just have to find things that are thin enough to work. And thankfully I found a couple straps that I really like, so it's not a deal breaker, but it sucks you don't have the versatility you should have from a 20 millimeter. If they made the lugs slightly longer, that wouldn't be an issue. But final thoughts, and I think this is probably the best watch I've ever experienced from AliExpress, and honestly one of the best watches I've experienced from a quote-unquote micro brand. I don't typically consider AliExpress brands micro brands, but this watch is of a quality that I think kind of deserves the name in a sense. It is beautifully finished, it is well constructed. Is it going to last forever? Probably not, but I don't think the movement's overly expensive to swap in and out. It's one of those things where they just did nail the execution here. Of course, it's not a wholly original idea. It even has in the listing for the watch the fact that it's called Homage Watch. So they're not fooling anybody here. They're definitely very much riffing off the 1921 from Vacheron. It's even called the Baltany 1921. You can't get more on the head than that. But they're definitely in different leagues. This is a $150 watch. That one's $40,000. So it's one of those things where I do love that this is offering something that isn't really seen in the watch market at this price point. We don't have a lot of cushion cases. We don't have a lot of well-executed cushion cases. This is definitely a watch that leans dressier, and I think the kind of sub-$1,000 price range needs more dressier watches that are well done and not just simple little quartz things or the Orient Bambino, you know. I think potentially the ultimate version of this style of watch, or maybe this version from Baltany, would be putting in that Hang Zhao micro rotor movement into it that, you know, Lobini uses or Baltic uses. That I think would be awesome. If you did an open case back, if you had that micro rotor movement, if this watch was even $500 with that movement, $600 with that movement, it would still be amazingly worth it. This is, to me, better than a Baltic. This is, to me, better than most micro brands around that price point that I've tried. Which sounds a little dirty, but it is just a really well-made watch. Did I just get a version that's great? Maybe, and it's not perfect all the way around, but I think it's very fair given the price. And if they tighten the QC tiny bit, if they offered something like that micro rotor movement, this would be a great value, and it is already a great value for what it is in its current form. But enough of me rambling. I think if you like this watch and what it looks like and what it offers, you should totally go for it. I don't think there's really many downsides. It's a good looking watch. It's one of those ones where from the moment I took it out of the box, I thought, this is nice, and it has now made its way into probably my permanent collection. I don't think I'm gonna sell this. So take that for what you will, and yeah, those are my thoughts, those are my feelings, those are my opinions. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you in another one.